We're continuing our analysis of individual sectors going into 2025, what our outlook looks like. And I think this one's going to be interesting. A lot of geopolitical implications, a lot of news always around this sector, and that is energy, and of course, more namely, oil and gas. Well, the energy sector, call it energy sector ETF, is only up, or in 2024, only up about 2.75%. Pretty lackluster year for energy markets. I mean, we've seen over market history that energy is extremely cyclical. Back in 2022, it had a breakout year, returned something like 60% when the rest of the market was down. Whereas the last couple of years has not performed quite as well. But I think it's really interesting to kind of get into the dynamics behind that and what's going to drive it forward or potentially downward in 2025.
Yeah. And so for a sector that's only returned sub 3% so far this year, there have been a lot of ups and downs. I mean, we've seen geopolitical risks left and right. And some of these, most of these, occurring in oil-rich areas and having a direct impact on prices. And so, lots of volatility, and geopolitics has played a major role so far this year. Especially OPEC Plus, really trying to keep the price of oil elevated. They're currently instituting production cuts of 2.2 million barrels per day, which, for reference, the global oil supply is a little over 100 million barrels per day. So it's kind of easy to just call it about 2% of the global production, is a voluntary cut in order to prop up the price of oil. The problem that they're running into now, however, is that OPEC Plus doesn't really have the reach that it once had. Now that the US, China, who's not part of OPEC Plus, and some smaller countries are, producing more and more oil, Canada, numerous other countries really just not adhering to any of their rules and just pumping what they want. OPEC's had a lot harder time to keep that oil price propped up. And, Saudi Arabia, who's kind of running those production cuts with their own million barrels per day, is about to wind that down. They're kind of tired of being the only guy really adhering to the production cuts and like footing the bill for the rest of the world to pump more expensive oil. And so they're going to start winding that down over a period of 12 months. It's, remains to be seen exactly when they're going to start that. But, that's kind of the time horizon that they're looking at. Along with all of that, we're really expecting more supply to come online, prices to come down even further than they already have. And they're down pretty far.
Yeah. And just to take a step back, I think it's interesting when you're talking about energy markets. And when we're talking about energy, I think for our listeners, we're kind of mostly going to be talking about oil, natural gas. A lot of the renewable energy actually falls more into kind of the tech sector. Somewhat ironically, or industrial sector, if you're talking about, solar panels or the companies that produce solar panels or wind energy. So energy is going to be mostly almost exclusive to oil and gas. But just to take a step back, really analyzing this market, it's so much a supply and demand situation. It's not simple. But when it comes down to the price of oil, it's really how many barrels are coming out of the ground versus how many the global economy is using. And we now have a very global economy for oil because it's shipped all around the world. I mean, there's a handful of countries really that produce the majority of oil and natural gas. And so it's about transporting that properly. And so the market for oil has become extremely global. You've got massive oil tankers that can transport oil from Saudi Arabia, from the United States, all around the world. Now, natural gas, on the other hand, is a little bit more restricted because only, in the last decade or so have you seen really the proliferation of some of these liquid natural gas carriers that allow there to be a global market for natural gas. Because historically, it's been, hey, if you have a pipeline attached to your output source, then yes, you can ship it somewhere else. But not until now that you have this liquid natural gas capability can you actually transport that. So just kind of taking a step back as far as the major dynamics in those global oil markets. And to your point exactly, OPEC Plus is a huge influence on that because by restricting that supply, they are able to prop up prices. And to your point, we are looking for them to eventually start increasing output. Now they've kept putting that off because they want to see oil prices, in that kind of $70 plus territory, but we haven't really climbed much further than that. So they're afraid, hey, we don't want to see oil prices slip into the 60s, potentially 50s. So we're going to keep oil markets propped up by cutting our supply right now.
Yeah, exactly. And one comment on your on the LNG market right now is even though those LNG carriers are getting built out, there were huge orders for carriers over COVID when, especially at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, gas was terribly disrupted to Europe because they got most of it from Russia. And so there's a huge demand for that international natural gas. And so, ships have been built and they're just now coming online. But the problem is that the U.S. hasn't expanded our output terminals. So we can't actually liquefy the natural gas and get it onto ships like we need to in order to be that global supply. So that's one more thing that we're looking at. Coming into 2025, new administration, some new priorities that are a little more skewed towards oil and gas that likely be a boon for those LNG, production companies.
Right. And I think that's where it's going to be interesting as far as what's going to happen under the new administration, because we did see in the second half of the Biden administration, LNG projects were essentially put on hold. And so you didn't have that development of further LNG exports or, and just broader oil and gas markets were really slowed down. Now we're looking at an administration who's, drill baby drill, very pro oil and gas, wants to get energy prices down. And it's going to be really interesting to see how these oil producers, how the companies actually react to the capability, the easier permitting, the deregulation that will allow them to produce more. The question really is going to be, hey, how much are they willing to produce? Because to your point, moving back to the OPEC situation, what they're dealing with is all these other countries around the world, South America, Africa, producing a lot more oil. And the US is going to head into a period where it's likely to be producing more oil as well. And so how are these supply demand dynamics going to influence the broader market? I think it's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, it definitely will be. So off of that, let's take as, step by step down from production down to export, which we already started talking about. This is going to be upstream, midstream, and downstream for our listeners who aren't super familiar with the market. Upstream really being that initial oil out of the ground, your production level. Midstream being that those taxi cabs, those pipelines, we call them taxi cabs because they, kind of act like that. We'll, explain that a little bit more, but midstream really just being your pipelines, transporting it from the oil fields from, West Texas down to Houston, where downstream can refine it into gasoline, into stuff we're actually putting into in process, as well as LNG that can be shipped around the world.
I think that's a great way to break it down. And so starting with those upstream producers, these are a lot of, you do have the super majors, your Exxon, Chevron, Conoco, Valero. These companies are involved in this, but there's a lot of smaller companies that are involved in the production game. And I think it's going to be interesting to see with the deregulation, with the increased permitting, how aggressive are companies going to be in producing more oil and bringing more natural gas out of the ground? Because of course, like we said, the more that you pull out, well, yes, it means more profits or at least more revenue for you. But if everybody's doing the same thing, you've got a tragedy of the commons kind of situation where all of a sudden you're bringing oil prices down, margins get compressed a little bit. And I think what we're going to see is that under the first Trump administration, oil companies really went gung-ho with the drill baby drill. They got really excited, started pulling a lot of oil, a lot of natural gas out of the ground. And that really did bring prices in, which was nice as an end consumer when you're putting gasoline in your car and it's cheaper. That's great. But for those companies, all of a sudden their margins were really compressed. They're producing a lot more oil, but they're not really making any more money. And so I think what we're going to see this time around is just because it's easier on the permitting side, on the legislative side to produce more oil, I think they're going to be a little bit more constrained about how they go about it. They're probably only going to put their capital expenditures behind the highest margin projects at least at first, to see where the market goes, because you're gonna say, hey, I'm gonna do the project that's gonna give me the best return on investment first, instead of doing all the ones that have a positive ROI at current oil and gas prices, because you want to be conscious of, hey, if the market moves against me, I don't want to be 6 months into a project or already have spent a bunch of money drilling when this actually isn't going to pay off because of where oil prices move. So I think companies are probably going to be a little bit more conscious of this, but at least for the broader kind of upstream category, we do expect oil prices to come in because of increased supply, which could put a little bit of pressure on those upstream producers.
Yeah, especially because the global oil demand is kind of subdued right now, with China having a really slow recovery, still coming out of COVID, basically. And their economy is slow. They have a bunch of people, a bunch of industry that has, traditionally used a lot of oil. And, that's a large portion of demand that's currently offline. So given those, projections for prices to come in, upstream is not really our favorite portion of all of this. What probably is midstream. And so I referred to midstream, those pipelines, as taxi cabs earlier. That's kind of how we like to think about it, is that when you have, especially when you have cheaper gas upstream, and there's a lot more flowing because people are using more, gasoline is cheaper. Maybe, you take an extra road trip or something, you don't mind driving a little bit extra when gasoline is so cheap. So people are using a little bit more. Those midstream companies, they are kind of mostly price agnostic. They're just happy to transport it from A to B. And so the more oil, more natural gas that moves from A to B, the more money they're making. So that should bode well for those midstream companies.
Right. They're getting compensated more so on the volume, like you said, than on the actual price of the commodity. So that doesn't matter so much to them. But to your point exactly, if you're producing more, those companies are going to be transporting more. And so it'll be interesting to see. I think the other part of that is you're talking about we're back to the supply demand dynamic. Well, hey, there's greater supply of gas, of oil products. But what does the demand look like from how many pipelines are out there? Well, if a lot of companies decide to start building more pipelines, you could have more competition. So you're getting back into the supply demand dynamic. And I think we will see pipeline growth over the next 4 years, very likely. And it'll be interesting to see, something that it caught a lot of headlines, like the Keystone pipeline was totally shut down. A lot of that pipe was dug up. It would pretty much have to be totally restarted. So that's not something that's going to get completed anytime soon. But I think you will see more pipeline projects probably come online over the next 4 years. And then kind of getting back to, the other piece of that market being LNG that we were referencing earlier, you have those ships that you mentioned kind of coming online, but they are looking for more output from the port cities in order to get that gas on the ships. That's going to be an interesting dynamic to track of whether or not those LNG companies, namely the export terminals, somebody like Cheniere, are able to really ramp up the export capacity in order to create that more global market for natural gas that really is very different now, especially if you look at prices of gas in the United States versus that in Europe versus that in Asia, very displaced compared to something like oil.
Yeah, when you talk about Cheniere's LNG production, I want to remind the listeners that the Biden administration put a pause on any additional, they're called trains that liquefy the LNG to be exported. And so there's currently a pause on starting any new trains to produce more LNG. Well, deregulation, the Trump administration coming in is likely to reverse that, likely to, get a lot of those up and running. So you'll have potentially a much more global LNG natural gas market. Like you said, we have with oil, like we see around the world, there's, basically two prices of oil, and they vary by maybe a couple dollars between the US and Europe. Natural gas right now, it's really cheap for us. It's really expensive in Europe, even more expensive in Asia a lot of the time. And so you're talking by factors of 10 in Asia a lot of times from what it is here. So making that more global will really help those natural gas companies, because if they're able to ship it over to Asia and not just keep it all domestic, I mean, we're still flaring natural gas in West Texas. So if we can find an end home for that, not only does it, reduce waste, you have perfectly good natural gas that you're just lighting on fire in West Texas. Now that can go to heat somebody's home, but also better profit margins for these companies.
And so I think that really brings us to finally, once we've done the transportation, we've taken it out of the ground via upstream, we've transported it via midstream. Now we're getting to the refining and the downstream, delivering it to the end customer. I think it's going to be an interesting market for those downstream providers. And these are the ones that you can think about as super majors, or what we would call super majors: Exxon, Chevron, Conoco, like I said earlier, Valero, Shell. These are the companies that are supplying that end product to the consumer. And I thought this was really interesting. I was doing research for this podcast and looking at what we call, or what the industry calls, a crack spread. So this is what you can take crude oil, it's come out of the ground, it's not refined, and then what the spread is on the products after the refining process is done, what you can sell them for. And that spread has actually maintained a pretty relatively level price difference over time, even in periods where oil's dipped significantly or oil has gotten really expensive. That crack spread has stayed more or less the same. Of course, in periods of stress for refiners, it gets, it widens out or contracts. But for the most part, even in low demand periods for oil and gas, it has actually stayed relatively the same. And so I think if we're talking about more volume being produced, more in the market, it could be good for those refiners. I think part of it too is the deregulation process is going to benefit them from a regulatory cost perspective. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see, how well they do based off of, hey, can you maintain the margins on these products? And then what does the end demand look like for that?
Yeah. And so that crack spread basically being the gross margins for those refiners, and having stable margins in the energy business in oil and gas is a rarity. And so that does, drive a little bit of, a lot of times we'll see a little bit of a premium on those companies. We've talked about valuations in the past, that price to earnings ratio. They'll get a little bit of a premium because they can have stable margins through good and bad times in the oil market. So that's really something to watch, something interesting to, look at in the market. And I think just to kind of recap, look back on it all, we're really interested right now in not only your midstream, your taxi cabs, more flow, more dollars. Your downstream is an interesting place. I don't know that that's our favorite, but it's a good place to watch. Your LNG is a great time for LNG. Really interesting, evolution of that industry globally right now, as well as there are a lot of really interesting services that go along with that. You have fracking sands, you have, just your oil field consulting groups, a lot of interesting, kind of secondary businesses that go alongside to support all of this drilling and production activity that we're expecting to see.
Yeah, I think the inputs, if you're talking about the aggregates, water, the materials that go into, something like fracking, something like drilling, I think the outlook looks good there. I did find it really, really interesting whenever I was looking back at the first Trump administration to get an idea of what we can expect for this next one, as far as the oil field services, because one would typically think, hey, those who are helping complete wells, who are helping the drilling process, you would think that they would have performed really well during that period. Well, they trended very closely with the price of oil, actually. And so as oil dipped over that first Trump administration, the oil field services companies actually did not perform as well as maybe I thought. And maybe that's a function of upstream providers can only afford to pay them so much during these periods. But if you go back to, as you mentioned, those aggregate inputs, those are essentially a fixed cost. They could go up if demand really spikes for drilling, but that's going to stay relatively constant. And so I think those companies are in a pretty good spot right now.
Yeah, it's a really interesting market. A lot of moving pieces domestically and globally. So, it's one of those areas where, the global macro economy really affects even the US based companies. A lot of industries, there might be some global macro thing going on, but a US company is going to perform however they perform. It's all on them. It doesn't matter. This global commodity. So, it's really interesting to kind of flex those macro muscles, as it were.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think at the end of the day, it is on a company by company basis. That's why you and I pick individual companies rather than invest in a broad sector. The sector dynamics are, of course, interesting. I think, kind of to kind of wrap up, it will be interesting to see what the global demand for oil and gas looks like over the next decade or so, because as projections are right now, global oil demand is set to continue to increase, but that increase is slowing down. And so it looks like we're going to hit peak oil demand, within our lifetime, certainly. And so that's interesting as consumers and businesses turn more to electrification, turn more to non-petroleum sources of energy. It'll be interesting to see, for these companies, for the industry as a whole, the sector as a whole, of how much demand is there, how sustainable is that? And then whenever you're talking about the companies who are operating within it, how do they react to all these dynamics?
Yeah, definitely an interesting time in the markets. Thanks, Victor.